maybe this conference can be really helpful for you. So this Career Days is an opportunity for you to connect with students and employers. It's an opportunity to connect students with the employers, sorry. And you can really ask a lot of questions and be guided for your future job applications, and also network with professionals. So if you're interested in the last two conferences that we have tomorrow, we have our website here. You can see all of the details of our conferences and the people that will be presenting, and you can sign up. We'd like to know if you're interested to have your registration so we can plan the number of people that will be there. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Sounds like a great program to me. Thank you. So. Hello to everyone. So we have an effort to make before the study-free week. So I hope during the study-free week you'll manage also to have a rest, get more energy for the rest of the course. But I think the topic we will be looking at this week and after the Semaine d'études libres is a topic which is certainly important and maybe a paradigmatic case how you can reach different outcomes and approaches also when it comes to freedom of expression. Maybe one brief remark about the slides. I saw that sometimes when you take them from one year to the other also, there can be formatting issues, so I have to replace them. There was a bit of a formatting issue. So just know that the slides have been put again on Moodle. Also, one comment for the week after the study-free week, we will be having a bit of a case study in a form of debate. So I think it will be interesting. You'll have to read a little case, and we'll be working then having two sides which will try and defend one position. So it's not a very formalized moot court. It's a kind of the discussion setting where you have the challenge to argue in favor of one position. Now, when we talk about hate speech, I think it also is important to wonder why is hate speech, criminalized? Well, because I often notice that this is something where there can be a lack of clarity, and we can't really talk much about hate speech and its limitations if you don't know why this type of speech is regulated. And we will then look at different approaches today at the United States and Canada. I think you may have seen that the approach is quite different between both jurisdictions. And I have made a bit more elaborate slides where you find also information then mainly about human rights instruments and the European Convention on Human Rights, which we will be touching upon next week. In the case study, we will touch upon an issue which is connected to hate speech, but it's not exactly identical. It's genocide denial. And there also we will have to think, why is genocide denial in many jurisdictions, not everywhere, but it can be a criminal offense. And I think the answer is not good enough just to say we protect the truth. A lot of false statements are still not criminalized. So that will be the topic then of after the study-free week. First, what do we mean by hate speech? Depending on the jurisdiction or the book you will be reading, you will find different definitions. I would like to stress here, I'm using hate speech in a relatively narrow sense. I'm not using it as a to describe any statements inciting to violence. I'm using it more like statements which incite to violence, hatred, or discrimination, but regarding certain target groups, groups which are generally protected by non-discrimination law. It's important to mention this because otherwise I would say you will have, if you understand hate speech in a very broad sense, you would also include statements like cases we saw, apology of terrorism, or in general incitement to hatred when we talked about subversive speech. So here it's really the target group is important. And I have on the slide a definition, which is the one of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, recommendation number 97. And you can see here a definition which insists on the incitement, promotion, or justification of racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitic, or other forms of hatred based on intolerance. And we can then also see a bit I would say ideological underpinning, often aggressive nationalism, ethnocentrism, discrimination, and hostility against minorities. The term minorities is important because this is also what a lot of discrimination law is about, basically, to say the groups which have been excluded, marginalized through history, they need special protection. It's not only about minorities, here it's also about migrants, people of immigrant origin. It's interesting to note that national hate speech laws might be more narrow. For example, in Switzerland, xenophobic speech is not captured by the domestic hate speech provision. For the Swiss students, that would be 261 bis of the Swiss Criminal Code. So there are differences. What is the target group based on national legislation? Now, maybe you have been wondering, well, what about other certain groups, for example, the LGBTIQ community? The European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance now also includes the LGBTIQ community. I would say it's a more recent development, also in domestic legislation, to broaden the scope and to say, well, calling for the hatred or against this community is also a form of hate speech. About Swiss laws, we had a recent amendment of our hate speech provision. It was extended to sexual orientation, not to gender identity. I may have already mentioned that our parliament felt that gender identity, they didn't know what that was. So, okay, they don't know what it is. But you will find other jurisdictions with a broader, I would say, approach here. Now maybe, how does hate speech work? Because we've seen a definition, I think very typical of hate speech, and we could say also racism more generally, or discrimination, is certainly that it starts off with stereotyping, that you will ascribe certain characteristics to certain groups. For example, it can be group Z is particularly violent or are criminals, etc. And every form of racism often will have its specific forms of stereotypes. If you take anti-Semitism, it's interesting that way, because you may have some stereotypes which in the absolute could be positive. They are gifted with money. Well, who wouldn't like to be good with money? They are particularly smart, but when used in respect of this community, it is then quickly linked also. For example, I put on here conspiracy theories, they want to take over the world, etc. So stereotyping and prejudice, in the sense of you have a prejudiced view of this group, and then basically when you see an individual with these features belonging to this group, you put the person in this, I would say, box, and say, well, all people are like that. All Jews, all whatever, people of color, they correspond to this. Then often typical, or I would say always linked to this type of stereotyping and prejudice is that you build a hierarchy. You construct a hierarchy. There is the good culture, us, and there's the them. And the them, they are in a way inferior. And this is where human dignity steps in, that you basically don't treat people as equals, as individuals, each deserving equal respect, but you basically say there are superior categories and inferior categories. And it's interesting when you look at also all the justification in the 19th centuries, human zoos, scientists, their approach was all about basically justifying also colonialism and supposedly Western superiority. Often this categorization does not stay necessarily just at a theoretical level, but hate speech can also, or racist speech can be linked then, which what I call here constructing a need to act, is to say, well, in a way we feel threatened, so we have to do something. We have to, for example, remove this population, etc. We have to protect ourselves. And genocide often works that way, that you construct the others as a threat, and you have to, in a way, defend yourself. So when we talk about hate speech, I would say that maybe fear is an emotion which is important as well. Because you instill fear in the majority population and present it as if, well, you have to defend, you have to act. And basically because we have then these hierarchies often, I would say, strongly entrenched also in society, in the legal system, they are sometimes perceived as totally normal. Or it becomes, well, we have to defend ourselves, so it's normal that we say, you know, immigrants, we have to chuck them out, etc. And this then often also leads to these tendencies of exclusion. Can be, I gave the example, migrants out of the country, but sometimes goes as, if you think of genocide, as a physical extermination. And I put conspiracy theories on here because they are not always, but they can be linked to an important part of certain forms of racism, certainly important when it comes to anti-Semitism. So maybe just one last comment. So I think it's not good enough to say, if you say hate speech is criminalized or because it's shocking, it's not just because it's shocking. It is because it's considered as potentially dangerous, leading to discrimination and exclusion, and also because, at least that would be the European and the human rights law approach, say, well, it's also against human dignity. Nevertheless, now, when you listen to me, probably say it's obvious we have to criminalize hate speech, and it's not always that simple. And why is it not that simple? Because as often we may have tensions in two ways. We have, on the one hand, free speech as a value, and if you take a very liberal approach to democracy, you will basically say, we have to let everyone speak their minds, and even if the statements are abhorrent, etc., let's basically, it's not very good to criminalize them, and better basically to let these people come forward, and others will criticize that point of view, think of Mill, counter-speech, etc. But on the other hand, you have the values of dignity, which is linked to equality, dignity meaning the equal worth of each human being. And if you create these categories, we've already mentioned non-discrimination as an important value to protect. And I would say those who tend to favor regulating hate speech laws will often also have a different conception of democracy. They will be less on the liberal side of democracy, but more favor a militant democracy. Does that ring a bell to you, what a militant democracy is? Anyone? Maybe the German students, they would know what it is. Eine wehrhafte Demokratie. So as you described correctly, militant democracy is the idea democracy has to be able to defend itself against its enemies. There is a saying in French as well, pas de liberté aux ennemis de la liberté. So basically it's the idea to say, let's not be angelic here. Let's not believe, that there will be forces which will exploit democratic freedoms, but actually use it to subvert democracy. Whether a system is more liberal or more militant, so that will also depend often on history. It's not surprising that, for example, in Germany, we have a system of a militant democracy. Bear in mind that the Nazi Party came to power through legal means. And then basically the basic law was also about saying we don't want to see this again. So the militant democracies might certainly clearly will have hate speech laws generally. They will also, for example, have often the rules about the dissolution of political parties, where you say at some point we cannot let this party come to power. It has an anti-democratic, it uses anti-democratic means or has an anti-democratic propaganda. The European Court of Human Rights has also handed down quite some case law about political parties, when can they be dissolved or when not. And in the European Convention, I'll be talking next week about, we have already, I think, once mentioned, Article 17. It's an abuse of rights clause. This is also, the convention was drafted in 1950, just after World War II. It's the same idea. So you cannot abuse the convention rights, basically, for a name which is against the convention and its underlying values, democracy, the rule of law, and also human dignity. So two different, the liberal approach is more a procedural approach, basically saying, well, don't read too many values into a democracy. It's mainly about, I would say that everyone can vote, every view should be more or less be able to be expressed. Also, when we think about hate speech regulation, you may take positions where you say, well, I think hate speech should be regulated, but the problem is the line drawing. If hate speech laws are not clear, then people may not feel that any kind of criticism, you want to talk about immigration, for example, you think our immigration system is flawed, or could that be hate speech, etc. And bear in mind the chilling effect, so that you will generally, there's a tendency to protect more speech, even speech which may be close to hate speech, but thinking, well, how do we draw the lines? And you will always, lawyers are always interested in borderline cases, that's clear. For those interested just in Swiss hate speech laws, there is the Federal Commission Against Racism has you can find basically they collect all the hate speech cases in Switzerland, even first instance decisions. And you can also search depending on the target group or the type of measure. And I would say most cases are quite straightforward. It's often kind of go and kill these people, burn whatever, so where you have to say, well, don't need much in terms of interpretation, but you will have borderline cases. How do we draw the line? And what makes it difficult also, so we want clear rules, criminal law, it's often criminal law sanctions, which are foreseeable. And at the same time, obviously, people who will publish or prefer hate speech, they will adapt their speech. They will try to find ways around hate speech laws. There's quite a lot of coded speech as well. So you will not talk about the Jews, you will talk about international finance, or Rothschild, when you read about Rothschild. So you may have here a bit of a conflict. Laws which should be precise, at the same time make sure that they are not evaded too easily. Same thing if you say for genocide, well, you should not deny the genocide, then there is a risk that people will say, well, there were some people died, but actually there were not very many, and so on, so they will grossly understate what happened and say, well, I'm not within the ambit of criminal law. So there are some tensions in here, and we should bear in mind the chilling effect. Now, when we look at the framework, and that's what we will be doing now, also based on a case you have read for today, what about hate speech in the United States? So just to fit it in the more general framework we have seen, you may remember the distinction between high-value speech and low-value speech. A lot of hate speech will be high-value speech. May sound a bit weird. Remember Snyder versus Phelps? It was the case of basically the people demonstrating in front of a church at a funeral and shouting, slogans against homosexuals. So generally, when you target a group in general, it will be considered more like a political statement, high-value speech. The case you have read for today, RAV versus City of St. Paul, was a little bit a special case because actually it was about fighting words, a category of low-value speech. You saw that even in that case, and we'll discuss it in a second, there was a violation of freedom of expression. So you can imagine once you're in high-value speech, in that category, hate speech laws in the US, they will not pass constitutional muster. And to give you also some examples, which I think are quite, I would say, clear. Very well known is a litigation. It's relatively old, from the 70s, but you had a litigation and controversy about the National Socialist Party of America, which wanted to organize a march through Skopje. Skopje is a village in Illinois where quite a lot of Holocaust survivors lived. And they were banned, the lower court said, from wearing swastikas. And basically what was interesting, it was the American Civil Liberties Union, which is the biggest, you could say, free speech NGO in the US. They defended the Nazis' party right to walk. I'm not sure whether Amnesty in Switzerland would do the same. And there's a book, if you're interested, where basically, I think the title is Defending the Enemy. So it's not that they approve of the movement as such, but they feel, well, it's about a freedom of expression. So here clearly an example that hate speech laws or limitations are really viewed quite differently in the US. And I have also put online an image of Adopt a Highway. It's another case which was decided by US courts. Does anyone know what it means to adopt a highway? Yeah.
So basically in the US, we're always searching for funds. So you can pay for the cleanup and the maintenance of the road, and then you have the right to put your sign as your little advertising to maintain the road. So you've adopted this stretch of highway, and so then you clean up along the edge.
So you could have a sign, McDonald's adopted the highway here. Well, the KKK wanted to adopt the highway. And it was basically Missouri said, excuse me, we can't allow that. I mean, that looks like we, the state, we sponsor the KKK. But actually they won on free speech grounds, saying you can't discriminate based on the point of view, etc. So this is just to say, if you have high-value speech, then it will be basically extremely difficult, I would say virtually impossible, to limit hate speech. The same goes for genocide denial, Holocaust denial, And this is also why a lot of websites with Holocaust denial, etc., they are hosted in the US. There is also a famous case about two people who basically they were also handing out leaflets, and that's how in the UK they were arrested for genocide denial. But so they were in prison, basically, but their website was still up because it was in the US and it was out of reach of the UK jurisdictions. At some point they agreed to take it down because it enabled them to get out of prison on parole faster. Now, the case, I've mentioned it for today, you read, is basically a low-value speech case, a case of cross-burning. Maybe in terms of symbolism, what does cross-burning communicate? Imagine you're in the US, you're a black person, and someone burns, like in this case, a cross in your garden. What does that communicate to you? Imminent violence. And why would you say it's imminent violence?
In the United States, like the history of the Ku Klux Klan, burning crosses has often led to like immediate violence against African Americans.
So it's a very strong symbol. I think that is important. For example, when you watch the film, I don't know if any of you have seen it, Mississippi Burning, you will often see, you know, cross burning, and then the Klan arrives and people run for their lives. So it's an extremely intimidating. And here also, you can basically, when you look at the facts, it's in your private property. So in front of your house, you have this very intimidating symbol. And this is what made it basically fall under the category of fighting words. You could also say the form of hate speech we deal here with is targeted hate speech because it's directed against specific individuals. It's not, you know, posting saying we believe that all, I don't know, I read this morning a case with my bachelor students against the gypsies. All gypsies are criminals. That is not targeted hate speech because it doesn't address a specific person. But here you have basically a cross in your lawn. And we will see how the court here, what the reasoning was. We also know in the United States there are special rules applicable to certain categories of speech. We have also studied together the clear and present danger test. I think it would not be excluded that in certain circumstances the hate speech may really, you know, cause a clear and present danger, but we saw the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which was a KKK rally, and certainly in that case, it was not considered a clear and present danger. That was Brandenburg. Yeah. And you can see a cross burning, so it's... Now, when we look at this case, RAV versus City of St. Paul, what I suggest is that we do first a bit of brainstorming. I don't know whether I think the case is quite complicated, legally speaking. I don't know whether you share this point of view or whether you found it was quite easy to understand, but maybe we can first take a few opinions. What did you think about the case? Points you agreed, disagreed with? Maybe also questions. Maybe some of you felt, well, I got lost. What did the Supreme Court do in that case? Any reactions to this case? Surprises can also be without you saying I'm against or saying this surprised me or not. Anyone? Yes?
I have sort of a legal question. So basically, if they decided that fighting words against a specific minority is unconstitutional because we're targeting them for their viewpoint and not just fighting words. Can this then go back to the city of St. Paul and they retry based on just fighting words simply?
I think that would not be possible because you would need to change the ordinance. You know, as long as you have an ordinance which is considered here content-based, or I think moreover there was probably also overbroad and so, or a vagueness challenge, then you cannot, as long as there's not another law in place, you could not come, you know, and try the person again. And then you would have a problem of retroactivity, of maybe also nebis in idem.
So in the US, it's not that fighting words writ large are illegal. It's that there has to be a law that says that they are legal in whatever state that is then being enforced or city. Okay.
And I think that in that way, that would link to the general requirement of legality you find under international human rights law, that the restriction to freedom of expression has to be prescribed by law. And if you can't just say, well, everyone knows that. And there's a lot of often debate also, what is the definition given in the law not overbroad? Does it really just capture fighting words, etc.? Not that I know. I mean, I'm not a US lawyer, but I would say as it's criminal law, it will be a state issue. So. Anyone else, RAV? Anything you surprised you? Yes?
This will be unlawful because it's contact-based. But it seems to me that if you restrict all types of fighting words, it restricts more freedom of expression. So maybe it's a little contradictory.
I think you're saying it seems contradictory to you to say, well, and it was also the dissent saying that now we have to ban everything, right? Because the countervailing force would be proportionality, just ban where the problem is. But indeed, you can have this approach in the US. And when you return to the introductory class I gave to freedom of expression in the US, there were these cases, we haven't read them, but mentioned on the slides, about abortion facilities, where states want to protect, women who go for abortion. And basically, they know if they say, well, you can't have any demonstrators pro-life, that will be unconstitutional, viewpoint-based, etc. So they basically will say, well, no demonstrations, supposedly content-neutral, around abortion facilities. So you will basically ban more speech than if you just said we address the problem. The same, the Phelps case, probably if as a municipality you don't want people to go and disturb and insult people at a funeral, you'll have to probably say, that within 30 feet around these facilities, there's no demonstration allowed, not to disturb basically the funeral. We will return to the fact, do you need to ban all fighting words or could you ban less? We'll see that is one point in the judgment. Any other reactions? Maybe also, I personally felt some examples given by Scalia didn't convince me all the time very clearly, but...
I was really surprised by this one of, we cannot think of any First Amendment interest that would stand in the way of the states prohibiting only those obscene motion pictures with blue-eyed actresses.
Yeah, that's one I also thought, what the heck is this? And why are you not convinced? If you had to criticize it, what would you bring forward?
I mean, that would be discrimination for me. So, saying that, yeah, for me that, enters into just discrimination there. So somehow pretending like the First Amendment would protect that doesn't make sense.
I agree with you, because it also communicates a message, a point of view. The point of view, I don't know, maybe could be that we think blonde and blue-eyed women are better than others. So yes, the colored or whatever, they can work as porn stars, but not the white women. So I think there would be clearly, and it's absurd, obviously. So under Swiss constitutional law, you probably would say it's arbitrary. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And I agree with you, it would also communicate a point of view. So, other reflections on the... If someone disagrees, feel free to disagree, though this makes it more interesting. Did someone see, in a way, were you surprised that the court even went further in examining this case? Once you know, well, we talked about low-value speech, would someone have said, well, I just expect this case to be chucked out? Well, it's low-value speech, the state can regulate. So I would say that was the first step when I presented to you the categorization, high and low-value speech. I also mentioned that basically this distinction has been blurred and narrowed. That, and the court says it itself in RAV, page 173 in the bottom. Our decisions since 1960s have narrowed the scope of the traditional categorical exceptions for defamation and other, but we still have a limited categorical approach. So one solution could have been that the court simply says it's low-value speech, it's a fighting word, unprotected, let the states regulate. It's not what Scalia does. He basically says, what is the argument to my argument, saying, well, it's unprotected speech. Full stop, that's why we...
So also that in the First Amendment, states cannot prohibit speech really based on content. So you have this one thing where even though it's low-value speech, government is still like putting it based on its content.
So it's true that they will stress this importance of content-based restrictions. But I would say a first move Scalia makes is basically to say, we actually don't mean it's totally unprotected. It's this sentence where he says, well, it's not that the category of speech is entirely invisible to the Constitution, but basically it means that we can regulate it based on its proscribable content. So the proscribable content in libel would be that something is defamatory, etc. What we have to admit is that the categories of low-value speech, they are also based on content. If you say something is defamatory, obviously you look at the content of the speech. Now Scalia then has to say, what is the proscribable content? Why do we ban fighting words? Any idea why is that a bad thing to do if you have a fighting word?
You said it's not about the content of the fighting, but the way of expression. Like, he gives this example of the truck noise.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
You cannot say we will ban a certain content said while using fighting words. You have to be content neutral even in banning a certain way of how it expresses.
So basically, you're right that he uses basically this analogy with a truck. It's like a noisy sound truck. It's a way of expressing yourself. It's not the content, but basically the mode of expression. Would you agree with that distinction? It's about just the mode. It's like noise of a truck in a way.
Personally, I felt like it made it more complicated for me. I felt like the moment that you were going as far as to look at specifically at the mode in which you said certain words or certain topic, then I feel like the lines become even more blurred. Okay, so if I say it in a happy tone, does that mean that automatically I'm forgiven? I feel like the moment he entered into that area, it, for me personally, became a little bit harder to.
And I don't think he meant, you would say, you're a goddamn fascist, I'm very happy. Oh, no, I don't think, but this is, I mean, if you take the truck analogy, you get a bit this idea. It's just how loud or how, but I'm not sure that this distinction is so that you can separate form and content so well. Because obviously, if you use, because fighting words are also often, think of Chaplinsky, a goddamn fascist, etc. It's linked to the content as well. the way you communicate something is also the words you choose, etc. It's what the Supreme Court also said with this case, Cohn versus California, the person wearing the T-shirt fucked the draft, so that freedom of expression covers also, you know, if you express emotions, etc. So I'm not sure whether the distinction really holds that, can be that, you know, you can say this is just content and this is the way you say something. But this is how he presents it. And then we still have to say, well, it's not like noise regulation. Noise regulation is something, a decibel, how loud is it? Here, why do we ban fighting words? It's not because it's loud. You can whisper them, they would still be fighting words. What would be the aim, you know, if you say, why can't you call someone a goddamn fascist or so?
I mean, again, I think it's going back to the US version of a clear and present danger. If you're issuing these fighting words and there's a clear and present danger to public disorder, that's why we ban them.
And what about the Chaplinsky case? There wasn't a risk of disorder. It's a policeman who goes to I think probably wanted to check the person says, you goddamn fascist. There wasn't a risk there would be a mob running and kill the policeman. In Germany, there's something a bit similar, Schmähkritik, I think. Why would you say you can't...
The fighting words don't really, I think he says it also somewhere that they don't really have this, that they don't express an opinion which is valuable for the public discourse because it just diminishes someone or it's just, well, very vulgar and doesn't really help with.
This is Chaplinsky. If you read the definition, it says these statements are of such slight social value that to a step to truth, we don't lose much by banning them, right? So, and basically the idea of fighting words, you could link it maybe to return to your statements. What happens if you insult someone so badly? The image of the fighting word is you feel like punching back. Some people say it's a very male vision, I'm not sure, of fighting words, that you could also link it to intimidation, for example. And Scalia mentions threats here, saying, well, you know, fighting words are also banned because they are a threat, because they intimidate, etc. Which I think, again, you have to see what has been said. It is linked to the content. It's not just, I think, a way you talk. Someone else had raised their hand? I think you will.
I mean, in that sense, you could ban fighting words because of the effect. Similar, and maybe that is measurable, if you look at data, what happens as consequence out of saying these words, similar to the noise of a truck. So it's also some sort of measurable way where you could say, okay, we'll ban these words because of the effect they cause.
How would you measure the effect? Would you say we have to see if there has been a riot or?
Exactly. Like if you think these words create immediate violence or pose a threat of immediate violence, that's for a reason, because there have been cases of immediate violence, right? It's not like someone is coming up with a word saying that for the first time and people like think, oh, now there's immediate violence. That's just a consequence of what happened before. That's why we perceive that word as a threat.
I'm not sure it would be easy to measure that, because in many, like the policeman, I don't think he beat up the person in Chaplinsky or so. But let's say it's more the emotion it creates, and that is not so easy to measure. It will also depend, I think, for example, whether you are intimidated or not, may depend on your standing in society. You know, if you're part, and that's maybe also something which has been a bit disregarded, if you're part of a minority which has been excluded, discriminated, etc., you may feel faster intimidated than someone who has part of the majority and doesn't risk that much. So,
but that might be again measurable. If you look at cases where things happen to this minority, and therefore you are faster intimidated after these fighting words. So this is an emotion, but also you can prove it maybe with data.
I mean, what we can measure is hate crimes. So there you will probably see hate crimes are crimes where you target basically someone because they are part of a minority. And it's the because is important. So it's not just each time, let's say, you have the victim of, I don't know, of a crime is a minority, that doesn't make it a hate crime. Often it's basically also attacking people without any reason just because you dislike the group. It's a case by the European Court of Human Rights, for example, a couple, he is Roma, she is the girlfriend, and they both get beaten up simply because, and she was also declared a victim of hate speech. So by association, because she was with someone who's a Roma person. And maybe psychologists would come up also with how do you measure intimidating effect, etc.
Setting where people could provide the measurements.
Yes?
Maybe not necessarily like the effect of the words, but at some point they mention like words that are socially unnecessary, like comments that don't necessarily need to be mentioned or to have an effect in society.
Where have you seen the socially unnecessary? You mean in the hates, in the fighting words?
Page 176, third paragraph. So he says, as explained earlier, see Sopra at 8. The reason why fighting words are categorically excluded from the protection of the First Amendment, it's not that their content communicates any particular idea, but their content embodies a particularly intolerable and socially unnecessary mode of expressing whatever idea the speaker wishes to convey.
So again, he reinstates that it's only about the form and it's not about the content, which you could debate whether that's the case. Maybe if we stick, and then we'll have a break, to this, the last paragraph on page 176 on the left-hand side, basically the mode of expression, it would be fighting words. You could ban fighting words that communicate ideas in a threatening, as a merely obnoxious manner. So here you can see the idea also that fighting words, you know, the reason why they are banned can be because they are threatening or because they, you know, really make you feel aggressive and want to answer. We'll have a break here and we return to RAV. We're not done yet, but
I cannot like access to the docs.
I'm so bad at the.
Don't worry, I can give you my number.
It's actually, I'm going to try to create a WhatsApp group because the, like, huge email.
Yeah,
Okay, what, where, what phone number?
So shall we resume with RAV versus City of St. Paul? We have seen so far that basically we have a relativization of this fighting word of the low and high value speech category to the extent that the court says fighting words are not totally unprotected speech. And they basically are not entirely invisible in the Constitution. They are limited. They can be regulated because of their prescribable content. We were then wondering, well, what is this prescribable content for fighting words? We saw that Scalia insists on the mode of speech, the way something is said. And we also saw that the court, for example, refers to the threatening content, threatening way of saying something. Then the question was raised, well, do you have to ban always the whole category, or could you ban just part of the category? Or maybe we go one step back to say, well, what was then the reasoning, saying why was this regulation, this ordinance here problematic? Someone mentioned, I think you mentioned it at the beginning, others have mentioned content-based, viewpoint-based regulation. In what does this content-based or viewpoint-based discrimination exist in that? Who is discriminated against whom, in a way? So basically you had, this ordinance wanted to oppose basically a form of biases in society. Bias, what was it again called? Bias-motivated
crime ordinance.
Yeah, bias-motivated crime ordinance, saying, well, the idea being that you want to, the wording does not link it to minorities, but it says, well, if you use these words based on certain characteristics, based on race, based on, gender, etc. So you could imagine theoretically someone using it against a white person. But generally, I would say it's much more likely the other way around. So you have certain characteristics, race, color, creed, religion, or gender. And basically, Scalia then says, well, if you use fighting words based on other characteristics, that would not be caught by the ordinance. Or you could imagine, so he views it as a kind of debate between two camps. Camp one shouts, for example, God damn, and put in a racial group. Okay, you insult a racial group. I don't want to start giving examples and slurring racial slurs here. And the other camp answers, you goddamn racist. So Scalia basically says, well, that would not be a problem. If you call someone a goddamn racist, the ordinance does not apply. So you hamper one side in a debate. Okay, and that's why he thinks it's a viewpoint or a content-based discrimination. What do you think about that reasoning? Do you agree, not agree? Would you construe that differently? You haven't read the dissent, so I have an advantage there. The dissent was critical in as much as it says, well, actually, there is no debate. We kind of make fighting words. We actually said we can regulate them because they don't contribute, they don't make any valuable contribution to truth, etc. So here, in a way, they get the value again of being part of a debate. But you understand the reasoning behind that Scalia construes it as a debate. One side is hampered, not the other. To give you an example, from another case that was not the Supreme Court, I think it was the Court of Appeals. It was about the ordinance on pornography. Pornography is also low-value speech, and the ordinance was inspired by feminists. Catherine McKinnon, does she ring a bell to some of you? And basically there's a debate what is bad about pornography. And one way about it, that's more the US Supreme Court's approach, it's against public morality. It's shocking, etc. And another way, and this is what Catherine McKinnon has been arguing, is to say it's basically more that it creates a clear prejudice, it can lead to more violence against women, etc. So the ordinance basically said that it will target pornography to the extent that it shows violence, I think, against women, or shows women as being subordinate to men. And that ordinance got challenged, saying, well, that's a viewpoint discrimination, because pornography, which would do the opposite and show, women as superior to men, etc., that would not be caught. So that's always this idea: you have two opposing views, and one gets disadvantaged in a debate. Scalia says it quite tellingly. It's mainly on page 175 at the bottom. The First Amendment does not permit St. Paul to impose special prohibitions on those speakers who express views on disfavored subjects. Then, page 176, this would be viewpoint discrimination. Sorry. St. Paul has no such authority to license one side of a debate. So we have two sides of a debate to fight freestyle by requiring the other to follow Marquis of Queensberry rules. So basically, you have an extension of the content-based and viewpoint-based discrimination to fighting words, which is certainly, again, relativizes the importance of fighting words, because you have now, in a way, the same principles applying as to high-value speech. But then Scalia answers the question, would it still be possible to ban just part of fighting words? And he does give an answer to that, basically. What would be his solution? Does he say you always have to say we ban all fighting words, or could you say, well, no, just part of it would be possible?
Well, and so I think he basically says, if you're banning the fighting words for the reason that we are against fighting words, but it's content neutral, that's allowable. If you say particularly obscene pornography is where our line is, it's within the reasoning of obscenity is not protected speech. Particularly violent fighting words can be banned, or particularly insightful or bad, but it can't be you're racist versus you're anti-racist, and one of those sides is protected or not.
So exactly, basically, it's the paragraph which starts off page 176, left-hand column, last paragraph. So you have to basically look at the reason why is a category low-value speech, and if you base the subcategory which is banned on the same rationale, then it is okay. This is why we discussed why are fighting words in a way low-value speech. And I think to say it's noisy would not be the good explanation. So Scalia says, well, because they are threatening. So you could say we ban just particularly threatening fighting words, not all fighting words. Maybe obscenity makes it's a bit easier to understand. It's to say, if we say we ban obscenity because it's offensive to public morality, you could say, well, maybe we just ban hard porn. That's the worst. Okay, and other forms of pornography, soft porn, some people might be shocked, but it's not too bad. But it has to be the very same rationale which justified the creation of the category in the first place. Are you clear on that, or does it ring Chinese? I think that's where it gets a bit complicated. Questions? I can see you'd like to ask a question.
I don't know if you could repeat it once again, please.
Okay. I will try. I'm not sure I do a better job. I think we need to know that if you say something is low-value speech, for example, it's a fighting word, it's defamatory, or it is obscene, it is based on content. I mean, you need to say if something is pornographic, you need to see it. It's based on the content. And basically, Scalia says we have to ask ourselves, why did we say something is low-value speech? If it's about pornography, why would you say this is low-value speech? Why do a lot of states, or even the Swiss Criminal Code has also a provision on pornography? What would you say is the reason often invoked for pornography legislation or so? Anyone? So often we say it's protecting youth as well, or say often it's still that the US Supreme Court uses this, basically it's against community standards, and it's interest, a bit the idea of morality. A lot of people find it shocking, sexuality, the display of this display of sexuality. So let's assume it's public morality. We say people are shocked by pornography. That's the reason why it's low-value speech, why we believe this is not, and it doesn't contribute to any debate also. Then Scalia would say, you could say, I am banning only the pornography which is particularly shocking for public morality. That's what made me say maybe hard porn, or, not all pornography, but just the one we think is the worst. But it's the same reason you still protect public morality. So it's the same rationale. And for fighting words, that's why we had to discuss why are they low-value speech. You could say we include them in this category because they might create, an aggressive response. It's not good for public peace if people or they intimidate people. So Scalia says, well, if you ban only fighting words which are particularly, I would say, intimidating, then it's okay. Does that make some sense? But you cannot say, well, only fighting words protecting, sexual minorities, for example, also, or directed at sexual minorities. Then he mentions another exception, the secondary effect doctrine, which is, I think, mainly developed in cases again, where it's about adult theaters, for example, limiting pornography in certain areas, where you say what we are targeting is not the content, it's not the fact that people are shocked, but you might have other difficulties in the neighborhood, more crime, whatever. What do I know? More noise if it's adult theaters and the people want to sleep in nearby. So it's an effect related to the activity, but not to the expressive activity. Another example he gives is if you basically forbid burning things, because you say, let's say in a forest you can't burn something, and someone burns an American flag. If this person gets convicted because you create a fire hazard, that's okay, burning a flag is an expressive activity, can be, if it's a protest movement, but it's not because of that you get a fine, but because you created the fire hazard. So that would be a secondary effect of the expression. Then he gives one example where, again, I was not necessarily totally convinced. I think he gives the secondary effects. For example, he gives the example also of sexual harassment in the workplace. Personally, I'm not sure is that a good example of a secondary effect, because sexual harassment through words, is that very different from hate speech? I don't know. But I found it interesting that he gives that example, basically saying it's a form of conduct, sexual discrimination in employment practices, sexually derogatory fighting words, which can be caught by employment law. Not sure that was the best example, to be honest. I think that it's a form of speech. So what then happened is that Scalia basically took these two exceptions and said, here, actually, the ordinance doesn't fit into any. It's not just banning the most threatening forms of fighting words, and there's not a link to secondary effects. The effect the state tries to regulate are the effect how people react to the speech. That's not a secondary effect. And then basically the rest of the case is to say, so we have basically a content-based discrimination or viewpoint-based discrimination on freedom of expression that can, in theory, be justified. But read this case by going back at the general lecture on freedom of expression in the US. It's fatal in fact. Strict in theory, fatal in fact. Brown, think of Brown as well, the video games case, very difficult to. And here basically the reasoning was to say on the one hand, yes, okay, you want to protect the minorities, that is important, we agree, but do so in ways other than creating content-based discrimination. A question for you. You are the Minnesota authorities, you received that case. Often authorities will say, well, we don't agree, but what could we do? Would you have a recommendation for them? They still want to fight against cross-burning and things like that.
I mean, you take out the clause that says that it's in particular for, when you're discriminating against race, creed, color, whatever, that whole list, and just say particularly intimidating or threatening or like have whatever version of reword your thing so that obviously burning a cross on someone's lawn is particularly intimidating, but it doesn't have to be because it's a target that is part of a minority group.
So basically I will show you what another municipality did. It basically wanted still to target cross-burning, and it wrote, it shall be unlawful for any person or persons with the intent of intimidating any person or group of persons to burn or cause to be burned a cross on the property of another, a highway or other public place. Any person who shall violate and so on. What would you do with this provision if it comes to if it reaches the Supreme Court? Would you say that's constitutional, unconstitutional? You burn cross-burning, you will ban cross-burning if it's the intent of intimidating any person.
Is the cross-burning only for people that are more likely to be part of KKK or something, or is it common in America and like both sides?
It's very clear that it's the KKK who's burning the crosses. Like the pro-diversity peace groups are not burning crosses on lawns.
That would be quite unusual, I would say.
Why is it not possible to just say, well, in general, burning crosses on other people's lawn is just not illegal? Just burning things on a different individual, another person's law, is just not lawful.
So you would say you have a general law saying you don't burn anything on someone else's property.
I think that would solve that problem quite quickly.
And what would you do with cross-burning on a public square? Would you say that's okay because it doesn't target specifically a person? Or?
I think that's more difficult because it's not targeting an individual directly.
But when we talk about private places like a house, you already have laws that protect the fact that this is your house, you can cross. Like people cannot cross.
So clearly there will be trespass. So the people did get convicted of trespass. You may think as a legislature, well, actually, maybe it's not clear enough, that we don't want any race, we don't want this intimidate. It's worse just to, if I go on your lawn and I burn, I don't know, what could I burn? My reader, I'm fed up with my course, I burn the reader. You do that in front of my house. Okay, I may be a bit sad to go that class, really. Oh, they come and demonstrate the bird readers might be trespass, but I don't think I would feel threatened in my life.
But I mean, why not change the law that's not only trespassing? Because it's not only trespassing if you're burning something on someone else's lawn, it's also, you could make the argument of a fire hazard or even, what you call arts directly, but like the threat to arts. And then similar on public space, you could say, well, that is a fire hazard in general, like just making the judgments on that much harder.
Then you would have cases like, if you then interpret very broadly fire hazard, that could then, for example, people who burn a flag out of protest might be caught as well. So maybe you will burden speech you actually would not like to burden that much. But what do you think of this case? Because that was decided. Someone said it's a bit weird just cross-burning. You would have, in a way, expected a bit more general law, right? If you fit with this logic. Abortion.
In front of abortion clinics, because it, like how you said it, it seems like it's only again targeting this one group, but not in a really. It's not so quickly to see that it's only targeting one group.
And basically, this is a case Virginia versus Black, which was decided after RAV versus City of St. Paul. And here the court felt, well, actually, this enters within the exception created with an RAV because you target the only cross-burning when it's intimidating. And said the court, it could be directed against any group, not just Black people. It could be directed against, I don't know, union members, Jews, whatever. I do find it is a bit artificial because I think, again, it targets, as you said before, cross-burning. It's not anyone will burn a cross. And it will have, we could also, that was the dissent in RAV, saying in a way you create an exception which swallows your rule because obviously cross-burning is particularly intimidating for the minorities concerned. If you come and burn a cross on my lawn, I will also probably not feel the same effect as if I were a Black person.
But on the other side, the first time I read that paragraph there, I thought, well, that might be creative enough to just burn something else that is not a cross, and therefore you just have to change that or broaden it, and therefore you give it less effect again.
And then probably you would need to find something resembling a cross, but not being a cross. It's like, when you have laws about the Nazi salute. And we have in Switzerland quite a lot of debates about that, because where are the Swiss? Who would like to explain what is the Serment du Grütli? Rütli, basically that's mythology. The Switzerland was created 1291 by 3 fellows being on a mountain and swearing an oath of being together. Now we have basically people who say, well, they make a Nazi salute, but make it in a way that they say, well, but we made it like this. We imitate the swearing of the oath. And how do you delimitate it? Because we did have basically this mythic location of this oath is a mountain in the center of Switzerland, and it has attracted on the Swiss national holiday rallies of the far right, where they did make sometimes the Nazi salute, and then basically in other cases the way around it was to say, well, it's actually an oath, it's not a Nazi salute. There's also another salute called, which is known I think also in Germany, the Kühnengruß or something, which is a similar movement. Or you have Dieudonné, the French actor who created the quenelle. So people will try to find something around, and probably courts will try to see, is it equivalent? Does the outside perspective, will it be interpreted as something equivalent to cross-burning? But so I just wanted to signal to you the subsequent case, Virginia versus Black, where this ordinance was okay except for the prima facie evidence. Saying you cannot say, well, it's prima facie evidence, you still have to demonstrate or show that it was intimidating. And Virginia versus Black was interesting because there was actually 2 crosses being burned. One on a private property, so that was caught by the ordinance, and another one was a KKK rally. They gathered somewhere, burned the cross, and there it was said that it was not targeted hate speech, it was more an ideological expression, not particularly intimidating. What we can take away from that, I think, reading RAV, And it shows that this prohibition of content-based or viewpoint-based restriction is very strong in the United States, and generally that will make it extremely difficult to ban hate speech in any way, unless you do something like here. You had a question?
I just found it a bit silly. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but the two provisions, like the first one says that they need to prove the intent of intimidating someone with burning a cross, and then the second part says that if you burn the cross, it is assumed that you have the intent to intimidate. So it's like.
I think why they, I think the second part was just to say, well, it can be difficult to prove intent, so that we will presume if the cross burning generally is done to intimidate someone, but you could still say or demonstrate the opposite. And they, in Virginia versus Black, the people who burned the cross at their rally, well, apparently succeeded because it was said it's more an ideological expression, it's not targeting an individual. It's a reasoning maybe quite different from what you would find, I don't know, in international human rights laws. Shall we travel to Canada? I think Canada, so I have just listed here for you other cases just to show that it's not the only case on hate speech which you have read for today, the Kekstra case. Maybe I think it's an interesting case. You have seen a teacher who makes his students learn all these bad characteristics about the Jew. I was almost a bit surprised that this didn't get mentioned, that it's a teacher who indoctrinates his students. I mean, that I would say is also a clear problem, but it was more concentrating on the case as such. Maybe where do you see differences in approach when you look at compared with the United States? Or what have you taken away from this case after reading it? Important elements or so?
Concentrates a lot more on democracy and protection of minorities, which is important to have a functioning democracy, and less on content-neutral or content-based.
So I think you're right in saying that the democracy is understood in different ways. I think in the United States, it's very much this idea, basically, democracy means also a free marketplace of ideas where the state will not interfere and start, policing what views are acceptable or not. The term coming back is always hostility, favoritism to certain ideas. That's inadmissible. And the Canadian Supreme Court has a different vision of democracy. It's democracy more, I would say, which is connected to certain values. There are some values which are part of a democratic society which have to be protected. What are these values according to the court? If we just extend the reasoning. So I think multiculturalism is one. We'll return to that. Dignity, clearly they do mention human dignity, and also equality, saying equality, non-discrimination is very important. So it's an idea that in a democratic society we have to recognize that citizens are equal, on equal footing. We cannot admit discrimination. Multiculturalism, is that something the court made up, or where did that come from? It's very typical of the...
I think it's in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's part of our Constitution.
So clearly you have section 27, the specific provision on multiculturalism, and the court also uses this to say, well, there is a whole analysis on comparative law. And it is used basically also to say, well, see, our constitution is different from the United States. They mainly look at the US, they say, look, there are textual differences already, different values, even though they acknowledge that the US have a long tradition of constitutional rights. So one difference is multiculturalism. There's no such provision in the US Constitution. Any other differences, you would say? Textual differences?
There's Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a balance that says that the rights can be limited within reasonable limits based on democracy and reasonably justified just and democratic society.
So we have there a general limitation clause. In the US, remember, there is no limitation clause. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of expression, and hence, as there is no limitation clause, all these debates, how, when can freedom of expression be limited? And I would say Section 1 seems to me quite similar to what you would find under international human rights law. It calls at some point for some balancing. You need to show also you have some, a legitimate aim why you limit speech, and there will be some balancing of that. Then the court basically does do also a comparative analysis. It rejects the American approach for other reasons as well. It doesn't just say, well, it's just textual differences. We have multiculturalism clause, they don't. Did you see other? I think sometimes it's also criticism of the US approach or so.
One of the things to say about the US approach is that it's not necessarily clear that limiting speech is like inherent in the First Amendment. Like they point to a bunch of
No limitation clause, you mean?
They point to a bunch of examples where the US does limit expression in a bunch of ways, and they think that it's not like it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to happen that the First Amendment doesn't ban hate speech.
So it's true that they also give an overview of the US case law, of all the cases like Boarne, etc., saying maybe some hate speech legislation is admissible. They also are skeptical of the US approach. We said they favor balancing. Well, how do they describe the US approach, which generally is not very open to balancing?
I think in some way they kind of agree with Scalia on the idea that like having anti-hate speech laws is choosing a viewpoint to support, but then they say that's what we're trying to do. Of actually for us, if we're trying to support a free and democratic society, that means supporting the historically discriminated against groups and trying to create an atmosphere where a true democracy would include the dignity and equality of all of its citizens to be able to be supported and heard.
So clearly they don't say you have to be entirely content neutral. It's maybe also an approach which takes more into account that there are historical disadvantages, that it's not just about being neutral, meaning, well, then you treat everyone in a formal way the same. But I think they will more look at also sensitive to systemic discriminations, power imbalances, and saying, well, these minorities do need special protection. But when we look at just how rights, the methodology, if the court examines something under Section 1, it also says several times that under Section 1, the balancing, it's not rigid and a technical provision. It's not rigid, formalistic, it's not mechanistic. They are unwilling to embrace various categorizations and guiding rules. So I think here it's also on the methodological side a criticism or saying a different choice from the United States. This rigid, formalistic, the categorization approach is more an American approach, which has its merits as well. It's justified in terms of more foreseeability. But I would read these statements saying we don't have this very categorizing approach.
They also explicitly address like the free market of ideas and like explicitly say that it's not that a free market of ideas doesn't always lead to the most rational or just conclusion, and that
So that's also an argument basically saying maybe we're not as, they had a commission, I think the Cohen Commission, which drafted a report, and there it's basically also saying maybe we are not as confident anymore that people are that rational, or we might be less optimistic. We've seen World War II, we've seen where that leads. People sometimes get swayed by propaganda, by emotion. Maybe at some point people return to reason, but then in the meantime there has been quite a bit of damage done. If you look how the case is constructed, they first mention Section 1, that there is a limitation clause. And they also say the approach is what they call contextual, so it's not about categorizing expression, high, low value speech, etc. And then basically they say we first need to check, well, what is the harm done by hate speech? So the reason to limit hate speech is not to say, well, it's just shocking. They clearly say there is a harm, and they basically identify two harms. One harm for the Canadian Supreme Court is the victims, saying that the victims, it's also basically it's a form of discrimination. You can also say you feel attacked in your identity. If the simple fact that you are, a person of color will just lead to the fact you get attacked, criticized, and so on. That is for the self-worth, the personal self-worth, it's damaging. And then they say there's also an issue for the society as a whole, that people can be convinced by hate propaganda. Some people argue that hate speech leads to hate crimes. Not that easy to establish. So the causal link, if you have hate speech, will you have more hate crimes? I think there are some studies going in that sense, but that is, I would say, it's never easy to demonstrate causality. But I would say also they talk about the social climate. There's a philosopher, Jeremy Waldron, which has basically said we also want a climate which is not hostile in general. So that's a public good as well. So they identify there is a concrete harm done by hate speech. And then once they identified the harm, they will look at proportionality. And their approach, what they call a contextual approach, is actually looking at two things. On the one hand, it will always be sensitive to the facts of the case. So I think you could have included here, say, well, he's a teacher. I'm sorry. I mean, that also makes it worse. But then they look at how closely connected is the expression to the free speech values. And that's why they then look at democracy, truth, and autonomy. We've already heard the reasoning, the court's reasoning, also saying, well, in its point of view, there is not much connection to truth, and we should not overstate here the ability, in a way, of the marketplace to counter this type of speech. Democracy, what does the court say on democracy? It does acknowledge, and I think you said it, that it is still, hate speech has an ideological component, that it still will limit something which, of that nature.
Well, so like on page 193, they say that at the core of freedom of expression lies the need to ensure that truth and the common good are achieved in science, art, and our politics. But then at the top of the next column, it says there's very little chance that statements intended to promote hatred against an identifiable group are true, or that their vision of society will lead to a better world. To portray such statements as crucial to truth and the betterment of the political and social milieu is therefore misguided. Like, that's a very clear rejection of the American way of, like, let the marketplace of ideas play out. It's saying we've actually decided what is true or not as the Canadian
society, in a way.
And we are not interested in this viewpoint.
So it's a different approach to this marketplace idea. The opposing view would be, we can never be infallible. What do we know? We should leave this open. And here it's no. We have constitutional values and commitments, and maybe history has taught us that actually, no, this does not produce anything good. It's almost a falsification through history of the value of these statements. Then on democracy, they also basically argue that it can have, I would say, a silencing effect on minorities. So if you are victims of hate speech, you may engage less in the political process. And you have a conception of democracy which includes these values of dignity and non-discrimination. The idea of this silencing mechanism basically is to say if you don't treat people as equal, they will basically feel marginalized and less participate. It's also an argument made by feminist scholars. I would say it certainly has, when you have targeted hate speech, I think the effect is very clear. It's well known that also, for example, what I read is that women, for example, as politicians, receive far more hate speech, and if you're a woman of color, it's even worse, and that at some point you might just say, well, I just leave politics, I've had it, I don't want to be each time, basically swamped with hate speech. So they basically, but this argument of silencing is interesting because it actually uses a free speech value, saying, yes, you limit the speech of some, but it may be to protect the speech of others. And they make a similar argument with autonomy to say, well, okay, one person can't say everything, so you limit the person's autonomy, but on the other hand, you protect the autonomy of the target group. So here, clearly, it's not, there are certain values which are part of democracy, and as you said, we will not say we leave this open. We protect, basically, this concept of a multicultural society. Interesting when we look just at comparative law, because the court does do comparative law, so we can see it discusses the US, but that actually says we will not follow the US, based on the fact there are differences in the constitutional texts. Also a criticism of this categorization approach that can be found in the case. They also look, I thought that's interesting, at international human rights law.